glad to be part of this event and have long admired the work of the Committee Against Home Demolitions that Jeff Halper has been so instrumental and brave over the years in making people over the planet as a whole understand the human rights abuses that are inherent in the way in which Israel purports to maintain its security. I've been asked to speak on the apartheid allegations that have risen to global prominence in the last 5 years. It's a quite remarkable development because there had been a long tradition among militants of alleging apartheid, Israeli apartheid, but it was seen as a polemical posture. But what has happened in the last 5 years as a result of a series of carefully researched and documented reports by the most respected and visible human rights organizations, including ones that had been associated with a sympathetic relationship to Israel, as Human Rights Watch is a prominent example. But there has emerged what I would call a civil society consensus that the apartheid allegations are now well established as a overwhelmingly proven allegation, at least at in the informal inquiries conducted by a series of organizations that have reached comparable, not the same results, but comparable results. And the underlying result that has been reached is that in some sense, Israel as a state is guilty of the crime of apartheid. What that means and how to reconcile that with Zionism, with sustainable peace, and what scope, what is implied by dismantling apartheid are questions that are not very clearly understood or delimited in these rather authoritative reports that have been released. What one can say at the outset is that it is an enormous victory for the Palestinian struggle for its basic rights in what I call the symbolic domain of politics. By itself, it doesn't change anything behaviorally or substantively, but it is a crucial development in what I've called the legitimacy war, which is waged within this symbolic domain and unrecognized is the fact that most conflicts of the last 75 years have been won or lost in the symbolic domain. rather than on the battlefield. All the anti-colonial wars were won by the weaker side militarily. Why that's become so, it wasn't true before 1945, but why it's become so is a intriguing question. But there's no doubt that it is part of why this Palestinian struggle for basic rights in the symbolic domain is so important and is, over the long run, quite likely to control the outcome of the conflict. And the Israeli response to date has been not to refute the allegations, but to denounce them and to attribute the motivation of those who accept the allegations as indications of anti-Semitism. And this is similar to the Israeli reaction to the finding of the International Criminal Court that it was authorized to investigate allegations of war crimes in occupied Palestinian territories subsequent to 2014. Netanyahu, you may remember, called that finding pure anti-Semitism. And it goes partly, the understanding of this issue is complicated because Israel in many ways has pursued comparable practices and policies to those of South Africa, which is the sort of template that most people use to assess what apartheid means. And yet it has notable differences in many respects. For one thing, South Africa affirmed apartheid as a desirable way of organizing a multi-racial society and called it separate development and argued for its legality before the International Court of Justice. Israel regards it as a kind of smear and slander and rejects the notion because since the origins of the Zionist project, Israel has sought legitimacy as being not only a Jewish state, but a democratic state. And because of this claim of being a democratic state, it cannot reconcile its reality with what has become established independent of itself as an international crime. In other words, from the point of view of international law at this stage, regardless of its applicability to Israel, apartheid as a crime has the highest possible status that it's possible to achieve in international law. It's what's called jus cogens, a jus cogens norm, which means it cannot be repudiated by agreement or by the action of any state. No state can do what South Africa previously did and claim the legality of apartheid. That's a kind of technical argument, but it's important. the other reality is that in order to become a Jewish democratic state, Israel, at its origins, had to secure a majority in a state where it was a minority. And how could it do this? By making it impossible for a large number of Palestinians to remain in the Israeli portion of historic Palestine, the so-called Nakba. In other words, the expulsion of Palestinians was integral to the establishment of a legitimate democratic Israel, and has always remained a cardinal element in that notion of what Israel represents. And this has expressed itself in various departures from international law, such as denying Palestinian refugees a right of return. The right of return, if executed, which is an established part of international refugee law, would undermine the notion of a Jewish majority state. And that would at best lead Israel to have to choose between being Jewish and being democratic. And of course, it has not wanted to confront that, although it came close in the 2018 Basic Law, which more or less proclaimed Jewish supremacy in both the settlements and Israel proper. And that's the closest it has ever come to the kind of South African acknowledgement of a white supremacist state. The second sort of background element here is the inability of the mainstream media or most governments and even the UN and even the Palestinian Authority to accept the implications of the apartheid allegation. In other words, although it has become a responsible aspect of the civil society understanding of the human rights situation in that pertains to the Palestinians, it has not penetrated mainstream media to a sort of shocking extent. If the same documentation, for instance, was available to establish Russian responsibilities in Chechnya or Chinese responsibilities in Xinjiang, there would be screaming headlines, and it would be given extreme attention. That would be an overreaction, perhaps, but what I'm suggesting is that there is no way to accept this allegation without confronting its implications, and its implications undermine the current legitimacy of Israel as a member of the UN. And the UN has recently elected Israel, an apartheid state, to the ICAHD Council, which is a kind of recognition of its normalization and legitimacy as a member of the state. And in that sense, it's treated Israeli apartheid, at least up to now, completely differently than it treated South African apartheid. A further, I think, fundamental implication is that these reports that have established the apartheid consensus are not completely, well, they're fundamentally in a certain kind of disagreement. The disagreement is whether apartheid is defined territorially or in relation to the Palestinian people. I was the co-author of the first of these reports, which was under the auspices of the UN Economic and Social Council for West Asia, ESCWA, and it grounded its inquiry into the allegations in terms of the Palestinian people, not the territory. And it did this because of the settler colonial aspects of Israel's establishment and because of the implications of the Nakba and the denial of the right of return. In other words, Israel has practiced a policy of deliberate fragmentation of the Palestinian people, which is non-territorial. And so our central argument was that eliminating apartheid or dismantling apartheid must be understood in relation to the Palestinian people as a whole, including the refugees and involuntary exiles, and not limited to territorial Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. The subsequent reports all are based on the idea of territory. The most limited of these reports, and yet the most eloquent in a way, is the recent report of the UN Special Rapporteur, Michael Link, whose denunciation of apartheid is confined to the occupied territory because that's the nature of his mandate. He was only authorized, as was I and John Dugard, who were his predecessors, to examine the conditions of Palestinians living under occupation. But Amnesty and B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch all consider the territorial orbit of apartheid to be coterminous with occupied Palestine and Israel proper. And it's important to distinguish these two approaches, it seems to me, and what their different implications are. The settler colonial aspect is also crucial, yet it's distinctive in this relationship. It's crucial because the examples of settler colonialism all combine a destruction of the native people. And one of the primary contradictions facing Israel was, how do you establish a Jewish state in an essentially non-Jewish society? And that, facing that contradiction in countries like Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, all resulted in a kind of genocidal practice. Now, Israel has resisted that and has not engaged in what would be either legally or politically or morally viewed as genocide. And in that sense, it's somewhat different than other settler colonial circumstances. Beyond that, there was a pattern of justification for the Zionist project that didn't exist in relation to these other settler colonial undertakings. And that was the long tradition of a Jewish presence in Palestine that went back thousands of years. The further fact that Jews sought a sanctuary from the realities of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism more generally. And that wasn't, although there was problems of religious persecution that drove some of the settlers to North America, that was not comparable to the Holocaust, which enlisted the moral and political sympathies of a large number of countries. Now, that doesn't justify encroaching upon Palestinian rights, basic rights, but it does create a complexity, a moral complexity and a historical complexity that doesn't exist in other instances of either apartheid itself, as in South Africa, or settler colonialism in these other countries. Now, how one factors that in and how one finds a path to a sustainable future while acknowledging that such a future is not compatible with the maintenance of apartheid. My own view is that the only path that seems at the present possible is a one-state secular outcome. Does that mean the reframing of Zionism or the abandonment of the Zionist project? Not necessarily, I think, because if the focus was shifted as it initially emerged to one of a Jewish homeland or a dual homeland for Jews and Palestinians, and a neutral state, it seems potentially reconcilable. at least conceptually. How one gains political traction for such an outcome is much more problematic. And one of the limitations of these studies establishing the apartheid consensus is that it doesn't clearly connect with the realization of Palestinian right. What are the implications? How do you how do you overcome this crime against humanity, which is what the apartheid consensus concludes, and yet keep the character of a Jewish state as it was delimited in the Basic Law of 2018, and how do you move toward a viable two-state solution? It seems not possible and not viable. And so there are very fundamental questions posed by this, what I called at the beginning, this symbolic victory for the Palestinians of validating the apartheid allegation and raising the question, where do we go from here, or where should we go from here? And how do we get, how do we obtain political traction for a post-apartheid vision of Palestinian-Israeli or Palestinian-Jewish relations? Well, I would only say that starting from the point of establishing this allegation of apartheid really changes the agenda, the policy agenda, and poses a challenge both to activists and to governments as to how to translate this new consensus into something that brings peace and justice to the peoples that have suffered so long, and particularly how does it achieve substantively the basic rights of the Palestinian people, which has always been the underlying objective of critics of Israel's approach to its relationship to the Palestinian people. But see, my contention, and that's what probably makes it very controversial, is that from the beginning, the Zionist project entailed apartheid because it came at a historical moment where colonialism was collapsing all over the world, and it could only expect strong anti-colonial, anti-settler resistance. And it could only establish security in the face of that resistance by a suppressive state policies. And those policies were made ideologically more provocative by their racial coherence. by the fact that this was to be a Jewish state, and a Jewish state in what I was calling an essentially, though not totally, non-Jewish society. See, and when you put those factors together, you really have to question the framing of the Zionist project. Now, whether it can be reframed is questionable. And of course, the whole debate over the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism tries to fuse Zionism with Israel, so that if you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Israeli. And if you're critical of Zionism, you're critical of Israel. I didn't formulate that correctly. If you're critical of Zionism, you're critical of Jews. And Jewish hatred then becomes an outcome of any kind of serious criticism of Israel as a Jewish state. And in that sense, the Zionist project has succeeded in many circles in identifying itself with Israel as a project that is the core identity of the Israeli state. And from this diagnosis, that's why I suggested that the only viable scenario that I am capable of imagining is the one-state secular outcome, which would allow the two peoples to live in peace with one another on the basis of equality and respect for human rights, democracy.
Excellent.
It's a vision that I've shared with Jeff Halper, among others, for a long time. It didn't require, in a sense, the apartheid consensus to make it a viable, a desirable scenario. But how do we get there? That's the transition issue seems overwhelming, and it's reinforced. I didn't have time or didn't take time to talk about the geopolitical dimensions of this conflict, which are different from the South African experience, because Israel enjoys this unconditional special relationship with the primary geopolitical actor in the world, and has the military capabilities that follow from that special relationship. And it's now been successful in normalizing its relations with most of its more formerly hostile neighbors. So there's a geopolitical dimension that makes it harder in many ways, to find a path to a solution. See, there's the international law dimension, and then there's the geopolitical dimension, and they contradict each other. And we live in a world in which geopolitics has primacy in issues of strategic importance.
Yes.
And we see that playing out in Ukraine at the moment.
Yes.
This what I call two-level war that's going on there.
Yes.